Welcome to our class. In this class, called A Jew from Tarsus, we're going to be talking about the Apostle Paul. Now, this isn't going to be a normal kind of a class where we talk about everything that Paul taught. What we want to study in this class is the life of Paul and the times of Paul. What was going on in the Roman Empire when Paul was serving churches? What was happening in the cities that he ministered to? What was going on in the culture when he traveled around? So we'll study the Romans, we'll study the cities, we'll study Paul himself, so that in other classes, when we study what Paul taught, we have a better understanding. We know why he taught the things he taught, and we'll have a context for those. Now, as we look at the life and the times of this Jew from Tarsus, we need to understand that there are two key themes in everything that Paul did. The first was called the mystery, and the second was called the fullness of time. Now, for us, a mystery is it's a secret. It's something that's hidden, something that we need to figure out. For Paul, the mystery was something that God had already revealed to us. And he says in Ephesians chapter 1 that this mystery, this amazing truth already revealed by God, is that it's God's purpose to put into effect, when the times are right, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, Christ. In other words, one of the things that was just a foundational piece of Paul's teaching was that in Christ, because of our faith in Jesus, we can be one. We can be unified. And as we look at his teaching, we see that all the way through his ministry, he talked about the fact that because of our faith in Christ, there is no distinction between slave and free, male and female, Jew or Gentile. Everyone is equal in their faith in Christ. And that theme is repeated time after time after time in Paul's ministry. Well, the second thing that we mentioned is something called the fullness of time. That has to do with history. Paul said that God revealed this mystery when time was right, that the church began when history was in the right place. And for our purposes to understand, there are really three pieces to that. First was the Greek culture. Second, the Roman culture. And third, the Jewish culture. So let me touch briefly on Greek and Roman culture. Several hundred years before Christ and before the Apostle Paul came on the scene, the Greeks were the most powerful empire in the world, and they ruled all of the area that Paul served in. And the Greeks brought three key things to culture that lingered, that still had an influence on Paul and his ministry. First, the Greeks had a strong emphasis on trade throughout their empire. They had created trade routes that went across the empire, taking goods and trades and ideas all back and forth around their empire. And that was still something that was in place several hundred years later when Paul served. The second thing that the Greeks brought was a philosophy, a worldview, a way of understanding and thinking about the world around us. Again, like the trade, when Paul was serving, he was able to use this shared philosophy. He was able to teach and serve and help people understand using this shared philosophy that started with the Greeks. Well, and then finally, the Greeks brought language. They introduced the language of Greek to their empire, and they encouraged everyone in the empire to use the language of Greece. So again, several hundred years later, by the time Paul was ministering, he was able to use the language of Greek across the empire. So the Greeks brought trade, philosophy, and language. Well, then the Greeks eventually faded away as an empire, and they were replaced by the Roman Empire. The Romans also brought three important things into history. They brought something called Pax Romana. That's Latin for Roman peace. For the Romans, keeping peace in their empire was hugely important, and they worked very hard to make sure that throughout the Roman Empire, people could travel freely. There weren't riots, there wasn't banditry, there wasn't uprisings in their empire that they didn't stop very quickly. That allowed Paul to travel relatively safely throughout the empire. There were still problems sometimes, but Rome was very good at bringing peace to its people. The second thing the Romans brought was Roman roads. The Romans took advantage of the trade routes that had already been established by the Greeks, and they built a system of highways that went back and forth across the Roman Empire. The Romans built that primarily so they could move their army back and forth quickly to keep the Roman peace, but that also allowed Paul and others to travel across the empire more rapidly and more safely than had ever been possible in history up to that point. Well, then the third thing that the Romans brought was polytheism, the worship of many gods. Now, of course, Rome was not the first culture to worship many gods, but the Romans encouraged it. They encouraged people to worship many gods, and they encouraged people to learn about gods, which then allowed Paul to take the gospel and share with people around the Roman Empire about the one true God.